She walked into his funeral wearing red. Not black, not grief. Red. Every man in that room had feared Jang Minho for 20 years. Loan sharks, politicians, police commissioners, they all showed up wearing the appropriate expression of sorrow they didn't feel. But this woman, standing near the back, wearing a dress the color of fresh blood, didn't bother pretending. She smiled at the closed casket, just once, just slightly, the kind of smile that contains an entire war. Nobody knew her name, nobody knew where she came from, but 3 of Minho's most senior lieutenants, men who had personally watched people disappear, men who had never flinched at anything, saw that smile and looked away first. One of them was shaking. Here's what none of them knew. That smile had been 6 years in the making, and it had cost far more than any of them could imagine. This is the story of how Jang Minho built an empire on the broken lives of women, and how one woman burned it down from the inside. But here's what you don't know yet. He knew who she was from the very beginning.
You have to understand what Jang Minho was before you can understand what destroyed him. By 42, he controlled more of Seoul than the mayor did. His legitimate front, a real estate company called JM Holdings, was just the visible surface. Glass towers in Gangnam, luxury hotels in Itaewon, a Jeju resort where politicians spent weekends they'd never photograph. Underneath that was something darker and far more efficient. Private lending at rates that compounded faster than hope, protection arrangements across every major nightclub district from Hongdae to Apgujeong, customs officials at Incheon who made certain shipments invisible on manifests. He had started with nothing. His mother cleaned hotel rooms in Busan. His father was a word nobody in his organization was allowed to say. By 17, Minho was running numbers for a local boss named Choi Gum-sol, a fat, sweating man who'd made the catastrophic mistake of trusting a teenager with a photographic memory and zero sentimentality. By 22, Choi Gum-sol had retired, which is a gentle way of saying they found him in the Han River wearing his own shoes on the wrong feet. Minho moved to Seoul. Minho built. Minho won. But here's what his inner circle whispered about when he wasn't in the room. He couldn't stop. Not the business, the women. His chief aide, Park Soo-ho, nervous, meticulous, stomach too weak for this line of work but mind built for logistics, kept notes out of sheer professional habit, shipments, payments, names. In 11 years, 341 women. Some were brief, some lasted weeks, but the one that mattered, the one that would come back in ways nobody anticipated, was a former flight attendant from Busan named Oh Ji-yeon. She lasted almost 2 years. She made the catastrophic error of believing duration meant something. On a Tuesday night in November, 3 years before the funeral, she arrived at his Gangnam penthouse carrying a pregnancy test. Positive. She carried hope the way only someone truly desperate can, with both hands, with absolute commitment to a future that had already been decided against her. Minho looked at the test for a long time. His face revealed nothing. Then he called Soo-ho. Jian received a wire transfer the following morning, so large she'd never need to work again. Then a second call from a man with a flat, professional voice. The transfer was contingent on her leaving Seoul within 72 hours, permanently. Certain documentation she'd accumulated, photographs, messages, a specific conversation she'd recorded on her phone, would need to be surrendered. She surrendered everything. She left Seoul in 4 days. But here's what Minho didn't know. She hadn't surrendered everything. She had kept one thing, a backup copy, insurance she'd never planned to use until someone found her in Busan 2 years later and explained exactly how it could be used. That conversation happened 6 months before Park Hae-won walked into the JM Holdings lobby on a Wednesday morning in March, carrying a portfolio case and wearing a charcoal blazer slightly too large for her. Interior architecture, a hotel redesign, hired through a legitimate agency with credentials that checked out perfectly. Minho wasn't supposed to be there. Insomnia had been troubling him for months, the first real vulnerability of his life, arriving without warning or precedent. He'd come in an hour early and was crossing the lobby when he stopped. She was studying the ceiling. Not her phone, the ceiling, like she was already redesigning it in her head. She had the particular stillness of someone completely comfortable being alone in a room full of strangers. Her face was difficult to read. Not beautiful in the sharp, obvious way he usually pursued. Precise, structured, the kind of face you kept studying because you couldn't immediately categorize it. She didn't notice him. In 20 years, everyone noticed Jang Minho when he entered a room. This woman was looking at the ceiling. He told Suho to move her interview to the afternoon. Suho picked up his pen, put it down. For the first time in 11 years, he wrote nothing. He recognized something in his boss's expression. He had seen a version of it before. Both times it had ended badly, for the woman. What Suho did not know, what he would not discover until much later, when he finally read the file Minho had locked in the bottom drawer of his private office, was that Minho had already run her name, 3 weeks before she applied for the contract. Because Minho had not found her by accident, he had found her because 18 months earlier, during a routine deep sweep of anyone connected to Choi Gumsol's old Suwon operation, a name had surfaced. Park Sang-chul, deceased, debt history, 3 collectors, 2 children, a son named Kim Do-yeon and a daughter named Park Hae-won, currently employed at an architecture firm in Yongsan. Minho had read that file. He had studied it. He had noted the daughter's name and her employer, and he had filed it in a locked drawer. 6 weeks later, a contract opportunity was quietly created at JM Holdings, interior architecture, hotel redesign. The brief was circulated through channels that by coincidence, that was not coincidence, would reach a mid-size firm in Yongsan. He had gone looking for her before she came looking for him. He didn't know why exactly. He told himself it was threat management, identifying potential liabilities before they became active. He told himself it was the same calculus he applied to every loose gred. He told himself this, standing at the lobby elevator, watching a woman study his ceiling. He almost believed it. The hotel contract went to Hae-won's firm the following week. She began coming in twice weekly, professional, punctual, sealed. She treated Minho with the same calm courtesy she extended to the receptionist, the junior architects, the catering staff. No recognition of his power in her body language. He began attending redesign meetings personally. His staff exchanged glances. He started asking specific, intelligent questions: lighting temperature, acoustic behavior of marble, the psychology of spatial proportion, questions that revealed preparation. She answered each one without reaction. He invited her to dinner. She said she preferred to keep meetings professional. He blinked. Behind him, Suho held his breath. Nobody said no to Jang Minho, not calmly, not without apology, not as if declining were simply a matter of personal preference rather than an act requiring extraordinary courage. He said, "Of course," and ended the meeting. That night in the penthouse overlooking the Han River, he smoked for the first time in 4 years. He thought about the way she'd looked at him, not defiant, not nervous, not calculating, settled, a woman who knew exactly where she stood and found the ground perfectly solid. He sat in the dark and thought, she doesn't know I've already seen her file. He thought, she has no idea what she's walking into. He thought, neither do I. Across the city in her Mapo apartment, Hae-won sat in the dark and typed a message. He's interested. The reply came in seconds from Cha Soo-yeon. Stay cold, let him come, we're close. Hae-won looked at her empty wall, put down her phone. She felt afraid, not of Minho, of herself, of the thing happening inside her chest that wasn't in the plan and had no useful name. Suho ran the official background check. It came back clean.
Too clean, Suho thought, but he was a man who thought too much and said too little, and he filed the feeling away. What he filed alongside it, a surveillance report that arrived the following week. Haewon had been seen at a Hongdae cafe with a close-cropped woman he didn't recognize. 40 minutes. A folder changed hands. Haewon photographed several pages. Suho moved it to the bottom of the stack. He didn't tell Minho. He didn't know, standing alone in his office, that Minho had already seen a version of this. Not the cafe meeting, but the name, the connection. The locked file in the bottom drawer confirmed what the official background check was designed to conceal. The question Suho couldn't answer: did Minho know about the plan, or did he only know about the girl? The distinction mattered enormously, and Suho had no way of knowing which was true. He began keeping a private record, a second notebook, hidden at his apartment in Mapo, behind a built-in shelf, on a small hard drive he'd been quietly filling for 3 years. He told himself it was professional precaution. He was lying to himself. He knew it. But the alternative, confronting what he suspected, required a courage he wasn't ready to name yet. Her name was Song Mire, and she had been 19 years old when Jang Minho noticed her. She'd worked as a hostess at one of Jang Minho's Hongdae clubs in 2011, the early days, when the operation still had the electricity of something being built. 6 weeks with Minho, then gone. What happened during those 6 weeks had never been filed anywhere, because Song Mire had told only 2 people, a close friend and a cousin. The cousin, now named Jang Yi-eun, was a journalist. In the spring of Haewon's redesign project, Jang Yi-eun began receiving anonymous messages, specific case files, former JM Holdings employees, dates, names. The messages were clinical, precise, and led somewhere very clear. Jang Yi-eun began making calls. Simultaneously, a prosecutor in Suwon named Bae Kyung-tae, who had reasons nobody had yet publicly connected to Minho, received an anonymous package: financial records, property documentation, a photograph of 3 men entering a Suwon apartment building in 2013. The men in the photograph still worked for Minho. Bae Kyung-tae locked his office, read the documents 3 times, made 1 phone call to a colleague at the International Financial Crimes Unit that had been quietly building a parallel case for 4 years. Then a woman named Han Boram appeared at the JM Holdings lobby.
31 years old. Pale, visibly terrified, she asked for Suho specifically. Security told her he was unavailable. She left an envelope. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note. "He doesn't know I kept copies. Tell him I want to talk before I do anything with these. Tell him I'm not his enemy. I just need to not be afraid anymore." Suho had the USB analyzed privately by 5 p.m. Recorded phone calls, financial transfers, a video of a meeting that should never have been filmed. He did not tell Minho that evening. He sat at his kitchen table with the USB and thought about Han Boram's note, "I just need to not be afraid anymore." He thought about Ji-Yun's 72-hour call. He thought about the photograph from 2013. He thought about the 341 names. He thought about the woman studying the ceiling in the lobby. He went to his bedroom, retrieved the hard drive from behind the shelf. He had been filling it for 3 years with exactly this kind of material, not knowing why, not knowing toward what, the way certain people build lifeboats on dry land because some part of them understands the water is coming. He picked up his phone, called a number he'd kept for 2 years without using. A prosecutor in Suwon named Bae Kyung-tae answered on the second ring. "I have materials," Suho said. "I'd like to discuss a cooperation arrangement." He paused. "I also need to tell you something about the woman named Park Hae-won. She may be in more danger than she knows." The betrayal came from a direction Minho was watching, just not closely enough. He discovered the Changsik leak in June, 40 million won through a dormant shell.
The trace led to a Busan property company owned by Hwang Tae-sung, a name Minho had considered buried for 11 years. Tae-sung was alive. He had spent 11 years building a legal case, not a robbery, a mechanism, documentation, converted officials, lawyers positioned and ready, and Chang-sik had been feeding it for 3 years. Minho sat with this for 72 hours. He ate normally, he attended meetings, he smiled at Chang-sik across a conference table and asked about Jeju renovation timelines. He was extraordinary at containing himself. Inside, he was not contained at all. He stopped sleeping. He had the penthouse swept for surveillance devices 3 times in a week, finding nothing, ordering it again anyway. He began reviewing 3 years of financial records, himself, alone, between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. His hands, which had not shaken since he was 17 years old, sometimes shook. Suho noticed his boss had begun having Haewon followed. Not surveilled, followed. Personal detail reporting directly to Minho, bypassing the normal chain. Suho noticed this and felt the particular cold of someone standing at an intersection where all available roads lead somewhere bad. He knew about the locked file now. He'd found it 3 weeks earlier when Minho had sent him to retrieve a contract from the private office, and Suho had seen the drawer ajar. He hadn't opened it. He hadn't needed to. The tab on the folder was visible. Park Sang-chul, Suwon, Choi Operation, the daughter's name beneath it. Suho had pushed the drawer closed. He had retrieved the contract. He had gone back to his desk and sat very still for a long time. Minho knew. Minho had always known. Which meant everything Minho had done since March, the meetings he attended, the dinners he arranged, the phone calls at midnight, he'd done with full knowledge of who she was and what she might want. The question that had kept Suho awake every night since, was Minho playing her, or was he, for the first time in 20 years, playing himself? Then, on a Thursday evening, Lee Chang-sik did not come home.
The following morning, the surveillance operative came back with a new report. Haewon had been seen with the close-cropped woman again, a second person present this time, Kim Do-yoon, the brother. He had been carrying a folder. He had looked like he'd been crying. "There's something else," the operative said. He placed a photograph on Suho's desk. "She was followed home last Tuesday, by one of ours, on Minho's direct order." Suho looked at the photograph. "Does she know?" he asked. "She looked straight at the camera," the operative said, "from 50 meters, for about 3 seconds. Then she kept walking." Suho dismissed the operative. He sat alone. He thought about a woman who had walked into a lobby studying ceilings, who had declined a dinner invitation without flinching, who had looked directly into a surveillance lens from 50 meters and kept walking. He picked up his phone and called Bae Kyung-tae again. "Move faster," he said. "She's running out of time." She was followed on a Tuesday night in late June. She knew it immediately. The same black sedan that had been 2 blocks behind her for 3 days, the same rotation of faces that tried too hard to look like they weren't watching. She'd spotted the first tail 5 days after the cafe meeting with Soo-yeon, and she had said nothing, done nothing, continued her routine with the same architectural precision she brought to everything. But that Tuesday night, the sedan stopped following her route. It stopped because a man got out of it. He was large, quiet, and had the particular blankness of someone acting on very specific instructions. He fell into step behind her on a side street in Mapo, not her usual route, a shortcut she'd taken because she was late. No cameras on this block. She'd noted that 3 weeks ago. So had he. She kept walking. Her phone was in her pocket. She had one number pre-dialed. She heard him speed up. She turned. He stopped. 4 meters. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at her with the specific expression of a man who has been told to deliver a message that doesn't require words, only presence. "Minho wants to know what you talked about in the cafe," the man said. She looked at him. Her face was completely still. Inside, everything was running very fast. Calculations, contingencies, the distance to the nearest intersection, the weight of the phone in her pocket, and whether pressing the call button would help or accelerate whatever this was. "Tell him to ask me himself," she said. The man smiled, barely, like he'd expected that answer and found it interesting. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something shifted in his expression, quick, involuntary, the expression of a man receiving new instructions that surprised him. He listened for 4 seconds, said nothing, put the phone away. He looked at her one more time. Then he walked back to the sedan and drove away. Haewon stood alone on the side street and breathed. She counted to 10. She looked at the streetlight above her, the way it pooled in a yellow circle on the wet pavement, and she thought about how much she had not told Soo-yeon about the past 3 months. She thought about what it meant that someone had called off that man in real time. She thought about who had access to that man's phone number. She took out her phone, pressed the pre-dialed number. Suho answered before the first ring completed. "I know. I called it off. You have maybe 4 days before he escalates. Send the signal." "Why are you helping me?" she said. A long pause, the kind of silence that contains a full answer it doesn't know how to compress. "Your father's name is in my notebook, 3rd one from the left, page 47. I've been reading it for 3 years. He ended the call. Haewon stood in the yellow streetlight for a long time. Chae Soo-yeon had been planning this for 6 years. She and Haewon had grown up sharing a wall in a Suwon apartment building, childhoods braided together in the intimacy of families who hear each other's lives through plaster. What happened to Park Sang-chul, factory foreman, husband, father, a man who borrowed money to save his dying wife, be consumed by a system that Jang Minho inherited and perpetuated and never once examined. The father had not died of a heart attack. He died of a heart attack caused by what was done to him in the 3 months before it. The collectors who came, repeatedly, with escalating methods, were Choi Gem-sol's men. When Minho absorbed Choi's operation, he absorbed the liability. The men who'd visited Park Sang-chul's apartment still worked for him. Haewon was 22. She hadn't grieved immediately. She had built 6 years of credentials, 6 years of portfolio, 6 years of Soo-yeon working the outside while Haewon built her way in. But there was something else, something Haewon didn't fully know. Soo-yeon had found Oh Ji-yeon in Busan in a quiet apartment, raising a son alone, a 4-year-old boy with careful eyes and a face that explained itself once you knew where to look. She had found Ji-yeon's backup recordings, the insurance policy kept hidden after the 72-hour call, conversations, transfers, a specific discussion about a Suwon debt collection that Minho had referenced casually, the way powerful men reference things they consider resolved. Ji-yeon had given Soo-yeon everything, not for money, not for fear, because she'd been waiting in that apartment with her son for someone to confirm that what had been done to her was real, was wrong, and was going to matter. "He'll find out eventually," Soo-yeon had told her. "When he does, you need to be somewhere he can't reach." Ji-yeon looked at her son. "I've been ready for 2 years," she said. The documentation was extraordinary, comprehensive, devastating, and it now included Suho's materials, 3 years of his private record, delivered to Bae Kyung-tae over 3 careful meetings in a Suwon parking structure. What none of them knew, what Haewon would not discover until 1:13 a.m. on the night she finally called Minho, was one final piece. The property in Suwon, purchased 3 months after Ji-yeon left Seoul, through a shell company with no traceable connection to JM Holdings, the apartment where Ji-yeon lived, where her son lived. Minho had bought it for them, anonymously, unconditionally, with no contact, no message, no implicit expectation of anything. Just a property management company and a rent payment that never arrived because it was already paid,
indefinitely, in full. He had done this for a child he would never acknowledge. He had done it because somewhere underneath the watches and the silence and the 341 names, there was a man whose mother had cleaned hotel rooms and who had never not known what it meant to need something you couldn't ask for. Suho had known. He'd kept it out of every notebook. It was the one thing he'd decided, with full deliberateness, to protect. The collapse did not begin elegantly. It began at 7 a.m. on a Friday in July, when a journalist named Jang Minho published the first piece. Within 40 minutes, the second and third journalists published simultaneously. Minho was in his car when his phone began ringing. His chief financial officer, his lawyer, his Incheon contact, all within the first 6 minutes. He didn't answer any of them. He called one number. Haewon didn't pick up. By 8 a.m., JM Holdings' legal team had convened an emergency meeting. 3 lawyers were visibly pale. The fourth had already stopped answering his phone. He'd been named in the Suwon documentation as a facilitator and had, by 8:15 a.m., already retained separate counsel. By 9 a.m., Minho's Gangnam office was a controlled catastrophe, shredders running in 3 rooms simultaneously. A junior accountant was found in the server room attempting to physically destroy a hard drive with a letter opener. 2 lieutenants had stopped responding to messages entirely, later discovered to have driven separately to Incheon Airport within 30 minutes of the first publication. One of them made it onto a flight. One of them was stopped at the gate by 2 men from Bae Kyeon-tae's office who had been waiting there since 6 a.m. By 10 a.m., Minho's penthouse had been served with an asset freeze order. His driver reported that when Minho was handed the document by a process server in his building lobby, he read it once, folded it precisely, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he stood in the lobby for 45 seconds without moving, his driver watching, not speaking, before walking to the elevator. He rode to the penthouse. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows above the Han River for a long time. Then he called Haewon again. This time she answered. She told him everything. Her father's name, the borrowed money, for her mother's cancer, the desperate arithmetic that only works if the lender is human, the men who'd come to the apartment, the specific Tuesday in October when her father had come home and sat at the kitchen table without moving for 4 hours, a man whose interior load-bearing structure had silently collapsed. The 9 weeks after, the morning she couldn't wake him. She told him about Suyeon, about Kim Do-hyun's trip to Busan, about Jiyeon and the recordings, about the documentation, the journalists, the prosecutor, the international unit, about the mechanism, and the months she'd spent watching it aim itself at him while being unable to look away from him.
She told him about Suho, about the man on the side street in Mapo, the sedan, the 4-second phone call that had sent him away. And then she told him the thing she hadn't planned to tell anyone, the thing that had kept her awake for 3 months in an apartment with a deliberately empty wall. "I know you knew," she said, "about my father, about me. I know you arranged the contract. I know you found me before I found you." Silence. "I need to know why," she said, "before everything finishes. I need to know what you were doing." The silence on the phone lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. When he spoke, his voice had changed, stripped of everything decorative. The voice of a man in a room with no exits who has decided, for the first time in his life, that this is not a negotiation. "I found your father's file," he said, "and I read it. I read what was done. I read the names, and I thought, the way I always thought, that this is a liability, someone who knows, someone who might come. I should find her first, manage the situation." A pause. "Then I read about your mother, the cancer, the loan, what your father did to try to save her." Another pause. Longer. "And I couldn't stop reading it." She said nothing.
I arranged the contract, he said, because I needed to see what you were, whether you were what the files said, a girl who'd lost everything because of something I owned. I told myself I was doing threat management. He stopped. I was lying to myself. Then what were you doing? She said. I don't know, he said. I still don't. That's the most honest thing I've told anyone in 20 years. She sat in her Mapo apartment, on the floor with her back against the empty wall, and felt something fracture inside her chest, not painfully, but with the specific relief of a structure releasing a weight it had held too long. The documentation, she said, it's already out. I know. There's more coming. The prosecutor's case. International cooperation. I know. There's a Suwon property, she said, a child. The silence this time was different, heavier, the silence of someone encountering something they carried alone and suddenly don't have to. I know, he said, very quietly. Why did you do that? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was with the particular economy of a man who has spent a lifetime saying nothing important and is finding the first attempt difficult. I became aware of a child, and I thought about how it came to be in the world, and I thought that. He stopped. He didn't ask to exist, and he deserved better than to exist invisibly. Haiwan closed her eyes. She thought about her father, a man who had done everything right, who had loved the right people and worked the right hours and borrowed money for the right reasons and had been consumed anyway. She thought about a 4-year-old boy in Suwon with careful eyes, growing up in an apartment that was paid for by a father he'd never meet, because that father had understood, in the only way available to him, that some debts can't be repaid, only acknowledged. She thought about what it meant to acknowledge something without excusing it. She thought about Suyon's message, "Have you become one of them?" She thought about the answer, which was no, but which was also more complicated than no had ever been before. "Are you going to run?" "No," he said. "Then I'll tell them that." She ended the call. She sat on the floor for a long time. Then she stood, picked up her phone, and typed one message to Bae Kyung-tae. "He won't resist. There's no need to make it ugly." The arrests began at 2 p.m.
Minho's office was searched while he sat behind his glass desk, watching officers box his files with the expression of a man watching weather he'd forecasted and decided to stop fighting. He signed everything they put in front of him. He answered every question he was asked. He named names they hadn't expected him to name. Suho stood in the corner and said nothing. He had spent the morning shredding specific documents, not to protect himself, but to protect men lower in the organization who'd had no real choice in anything they'd done. Suho had his own moral architecture, quietly maintained through 11 years of proximity to things he'd never chosen. His cooperation arrangement with Bae Kyung-tae was already in place. When the officer asked Minho about certain Incheon arrangements, Minho answered completely and directed them to 3 specific file locations. When the officer looked surprised, Minho said, quietly, "I'm aware of how this works. I'd prefer it to work correctly." The officer wrote that down and didn't fully understand it. Suho understood it. By evening, JM Holdings was functionally dissolved. The Gangnam Towers, the Itaewon hotels, the Jeju Resort, all frozen, all under investigation, all beginning the slow legal process of becoming something else. Hwang Tae-sung's parallel case activated, but found less to work with than anticipated. Chang Shik's absence had dismantled part of his witness structure. Even in collapse, there was precision in Minho. He was formally arrested at 6 p.m. He walked to the vehicle without being guided. Dark suit, His watch, the one that cost more than an apartment, was gone. He'd handed it to Suho that morning. 2 families. You know which ones. Suho had stood in his car afterward and looked at the watch for a long time. Then he'd driven to a pawn shop in Mapo and sold it for 40% of its value because he didn't want to wait, and divided the amount into 2 equal transfers before the day ended. The 3rd lieutenant who'd been shaking at the funeral, the one who'd watched Hae-won smile, turned himself in to Bae Kyung-tae's office at 4 p.m., 4 hours before the formal arrest, with his own documentation and his own cooperation offer. He had been afraid for a long time, he told them. He had been waiting for someone to make it possible to stop being afraid. There is a final piece, the one that changes everything that came before it. Minho had kept one document that was not in any official file, not in any drawer his lawyers examined, not in any record Suho had ever seen. It was a letter, handwritten, never sent. It was addressed to Park Song-chul. It had been written 4 months before Hae-won walked into the JM Holdings lobby, 2 months after Minho had first read the Suwon file, first found her name, first arranged the contract that would bring her close enough to see. The letter acknowledged what had been done, not in legal language, not in the language of liability and settlement, in the language of a man who had, for the first time in his life, read something about himself that he couldn't rationalize away, and had sat in a penthouse above the Han River for 4 hours, unable to move. He had not sent it because there was no one to send it to. Park Song-chul was gone. He had kept it because getting rid of it felt like the last and worst version of what he'd been doing his whole life, making things disappear because looking at them was inconvenient. Suho found the letter when he was clearing the private office. He read it once. He put it in an envelope. He drove to Suwon. He left it in the mailbox of Park Hae-won's childhood address, which was now occupied by strangers who would have no idea what to do with it. Then he drove back to Seoul and went to bed, and slept for 11 hours without waking.
At the funeral, his mother's, the woman who had cleaned hotel rooms in Busan, who died without knowing the full architecture of what her son had become, Hae-won stood near the back in red. Not defiance, not victory, a color her father had once said her mother looked most alive in. She had wanted to carry something living into a room full of grief. Cha Soo-yeon stood beside her in black, holding her hand. Soo-yeon had not expected to still be holding her hand. She had expected, after 6 years of architecture and patience and fury, to feel complete. She felt something more complicated, the specific exhaustion of people who have done a necessary thing and must now figure out who they are when the necessary thing is finished. Across the room, Suho stood alone near a window. He caught Hae-won's eye once. He didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply looked at her with the expression of a man who understands that some transactions are not recorded in any notebook, and that this is not a failing, but a kind of grace. Hae-won looked at the closed casket at the front of the room. She thought about a woman who had cleaned hotel rooms so her son could be something else. She thought about what that son had become and what it had cost, and the long chain of costs it had generated in every direction, radiating outward like cracks from a point of impact, touching people who never knew where the cracks started. She thought about her father, Park Sang-chul, factory foreman, husband, father of 2. His name was in 3 newspaper articles, 2 court filings, and a formal investigative report that would outlast everyone in this room. He was no longer a footnote. Somewhere in Suwon, a 4-year-old boy with careful eyes was building something from nothing, the way children do, without irony, without calculation, while his mother watched from across the room and thought about the envelope that had arrived last week with no return address. She had read the letter inside once. She had folded it and put it away in a place she wouldn't look at often but would never throw away. In a minimum security facility outside Seoul, Jang Minho sat in a room with no watches on the wall and thought about a ceiling. Not his, a lobby ceiling. A woman studying it on a Wednesday morning in March before she'd said a single word to him. He thought about what it meant to look up at a structure that needed changing and simply begin, quietly, to imagine how it could be different. He thought he was beginning to understand it. He thought it might be the only useful thing he'd learned in 42 years. Outside the funeral home, Seoul moved with its customary indifference. The Han River caught the evening light and made something beautiful out of it, the way rivers do, without effort, without memory, simply by being present and continuing. Haewon walked out into the cool air. She did not look back. She had never been the victim. She had never been the predator. She had been something Jang Minho had been searching for across 341 attempts without knowing what he was looking for. A person who could see him completely, every file, every name, every locked drawer, and respond not with absolution, not with destruction, but with something harder and rarer than either. The truth, delivered fully, without flinching. Behind her, the shaking lieutenant watched her go. He thought about the documents, the names, the photograph from 2013, his own name, appearing in which notebooks, on which pages. He thought about the cooperation arrangement he'd already signed. He thought about a man in a facility outside Seoul, sitting in a room with no watches, learning for the first time in his life what it felt like to stop running from something. He thought, maybe that's how it ends for all of us. He walked to his car in the cold. He did not look back either. Some empires don't fall. They're simply shown what they were built on, and the men who built them make, for the first time, a different choice. Not redemption, just honesty. Sometimes that has to be enough.
Please like and subscribe.